the deadliest blade is never the one pressed against your throat. It is the pen held loosely in the hand of the man standing behind you. Under the warm, cinematic glow of the executive dining room's golden chandelier, where empires were quietly carved up over courses of rare wagyu, a corporate execution was taking place line by line. Elizabeth felt the heavy, suffocating tension radiating from the center of the wood-paneled room, a jarring note in an otherwise perfectly orchestrated dinner. As she glided past the leather seating with the practiced anonymity of high-end staff, a silent shadow in a crisp white button-down and black vest. But Elizabeth was far from oblivious. She was merely studying the board from a place powerful men never bothered to look. Her hands, flawlessly steady as she cleared the fine china, completely masked the sudden violent spike of her pulse. She had been playing the part of a powerless worker for months. A unnecessary exile ever since the investigative career she built had been torn apart by corporate predators. Tonight, however, the dormant instincts of her past were bleeding back into reality, sharp and undeniable. Before we uncover how Elizabeth breaks her silence and outsmarts the syndicate, make sure to drop a like and subscribe to Hidden Mafia Chronicles. Now, let's step back to the table. The light from the massive golden chandelier cast sharp and high-contrast shadows across the rich mahogany walls of the private dining room. It was a space designed for secrets, bathed in a warm, moody glow that deepened the shadows and made the heavy leather seating look almost pitch black. Elizabeth moved through this curated darkness with practiced grace, a silver tray balanced effortlessly on her fingertips. The room's ventilation hummed, providing a low, steady baseline beneath the muffled clinking of crystal from the well-dressed diners in the blurred distance. But her focus remained entirely anchored on the center table. Directly beneath the cascading light of the chandelier sat Hyeonjong Park. He possessed a stillness that naturally commanded the room, his rugged jawline dusted with a slight experienced stubble. Dressed in a flawless tailored black three-piece suit paired with a pristine white shirt and a light silver tie, he was a monolith of sheer authority. A heavy luxury watch peeked out from his cuff, catching the gleam of the overhead bulbs. Yet as Elizabeth approached the perimeter of the table to clear a discarded appetizer plate, she noticed the subtle fractures in his composure. His dark eyes were locked dead onto the thick contract spread before him. His heavy brows were deeply furrowed in a mixture of confusion and concern. His right hand gripped a fountain pen with white-knuckled intensity, and hovering just inches above the dotted line, while his left hand pressed firmly into the table as if trying to physically anchor himself to reality. He was hesitating. The undisputed head of the syndicate was pausing at the edge of a cliff. The true source of the room's suffocating unease wasn't just in Park's hesitation. It was the man standing directly behind his left shoulder. The advisor, clad in a sharp dark navy suit, stood with a stiffness that betrayed his polished exterior. While his observant features were carved into harsh angles by the overhead light, his eyes narrowed as they darted anxiously between the boss and the paperwork. His arms hung tensely by his sides, his body angled forward just a fraction of an inch, the unmistakable posture of a man holding his breath, desperately waiting for a snare to snap shut. To the casual observer, it was merely a high-level business deal nearing its natural conclusion. But to Elizabeth, whose mind had spent years dissecting the anatomy of corporate ruin, the silent power dynamics were deafening. The advisor's forced stillness wasn't an act of respect. It was raw, barely concealed anticipation. Park's hesitation wasn't standard caution. It was a predator's primal instinct, warning him of a danger he couldn't quite see. Elizabeth smoothed her black vest and stepped slightly closer to the table, her eyes drawn to the crisp white pages illuminated under the golden light. The trap was there, buried somewhere in the ink, and the timer was rapidly running out. Elizabeth retreated half a step into the peripheral gloom, allowing the soft, shallow depth of the room's lighting to swallow her presence. To the men at the center table, she was nothing more than a blur in a white collar, a piece of the restaurant's background architecture. But from her vantage point in the shadows, her focus sharpened with razor-like precision on the man in the dark navy suit. And he was positioned meticulously to Hyeonjong Park's left, just outside the direct glare of the chandelier, yet close enough that the high-contrast light caught the sharp, almost predatory angles of his cheekbones. In the world of high-stakes syndicates, a trusted advisor or business partner was meant to be a relaxed anchor, a cool, detached presence projecting absolute confidence to reinforce the boss's decisions. This man was projecting nothing but barely contained panic. Now Elizabeth's eyes narrowed, her mind slipping effortlessly into the analytical rhythms she had relied upon for years as a corporate investigator. She silently cataloged his micro-expressions. The advisor's well-styled black hair remained immaculate, but a fine, nervous tension radiated from his neck. His hands, hanging by his sides, were rigid, the fingers twitching in microscopic spasms of adrenaline. He was leaning forward, invading Park's space by fractions of an inch, his dark eyes intensely tracking the slight movements of the pen rather than scanning the room for external threats. He was not guarding the boss, he was guarding the outcome. The silence in the private suite stretched, growing heavier and more brittle with every passing second. As Park's confusion and hesitation deepened, a muscle in the advisor's jaw feathered. He let out a slow, controlled breath, attempting to mask a sudden, telltale shift in his weight. And it was the body language of a man who had rigged a demolition charge and was terrified the detonator might fail. Elizabeth had seen that exact stance before, in sterile boardrooms, in the mirrored glass of corporate high-rises, on the faces of executives right before their massive, carefully constructed lies were finalized in ink. The danger wasn't waiting in the alleyways outside, nor was it hidden in the blurred, murmuring distance of the formal dining area. It was right here, even disguised as loyalty. The advisor was waiting for the ink to dry on a death warrant. A cold, familiar dread pooled in Elizabeth's stomach. The urge to turn away, to retreat to the safety of the service corridor, and let the wolves tear each other apart was deafening. But the warm, cinematic glow of the room seemed to pinpoint the exact spot on the contract where Park's pen hovered. The trap was laid perfectly in front of a man who had no idea he was being hunted. And Elizabeth knew she was the only person in the room who could see the wire. Elizabeth knew she had to bridge the physical gap between the safety of the shadows and the exposed center table. The excuse was simple enough, a heavy crystal water pitcher glistening with condensation on her tray. Moving with the practiced, invisible rhythm of a high-end server, she stepped out of the periphery and into the warm, heavy aura of the chandelier. The air immediately felt thicker here. She charged with the dangerous static of a massive collision waiting to happen. She approached Hyeonjong Park from the right side, her posture a picture of perfect, deferential servitude. As she leaned forward slightly to refill his glass, the angle provided exactly what she needed. The thick, cream-colored pages of the contract lay completely exposed under the stark, dramatic overhead lighting. Park's hesitation had stalled his hand right at the bottom of the final page, now his pen casting a sharp shadow over the dotted line. While the ice clinked softly against the crystal, Elizabeth's eyes dropped to the densely packed block of fine print sitting just inches above his knuckles. It was an involuntary reflex, a ghost of her past life violently pulling her back into the present. Her mind effortlessly stripped away the labyrinth of bloated legalese and predatory formatting. Irrevocable proxy, unconditional forfeiture of controlling equity, immediate transfer of primary assets to the secondary holding entity. The specific combination of terms jumped off the page, burning themselves into her retinas with terrifying clarity. It was a masterpiece of corporate camouflage, to a powerful man accustomed to ruling through intimidation, strategy, and brute force. The paragraph read like a standard, albeit excessively dense liability waiver for a new logistical partnership. But to a former fraud investigator who had spent years hunting white-collar phantoms, the architecture of the deception was sickeningly obvious. The secondary holding entity wasn't a shared safety net, it was a shell company. And Elizabeth would bet her entire life that the nervous, sweating advisor hovering over Park's left shoulder was its sole anonymous beneficiary. This wasn't a business deal. It was a financial guillotine. The moment Park's pen bled ink onto that paper, he would legally sever his own head, instantly transferring the entirety of his legitimate empire to the man standing quietly behind him. The sheer audacity of the trap sent a cold, sharp shockwave through Elizabeth's chest. Her hand remained flawlessly steady, the iced water pouring in a perfect, unbroken stream. But behind her smooth, focused features, a fierce internal battle had just ignited. She straightened up, stepping back from the table with her tray. Park shifted his weight, his grip tightening on the pen as the advisor murmured something low and encouraging in Korean. The trap was armed, the timer was at 0, and Elizabeth carried the devastating weight of knowing exactly how the explosion would happen. Elizabeth backed away from the halo of the golden chandelier, retreating into the muted, high-contrast shadows of the oak-paneled service station. The physical distance should have offered a reprieve, but the air in her lungs felt like crushed glass. When she placed the sweating crystal pitcher onto a polished steel counter, her hands finally betraying the tremor she had fought so hard to suppress. The soft, ambient murmur of the luxury dining room blurred into a shallow depth of field, leaving only the center table sharply in focus. She squeezed her eyes shut, but the darkness offered no sanctuary. Instead, it dragged her violently back to a sterile, overlit boardroom 2 years ago. The memory tasted like ash. She remembered the exact weight of the forensic accounting dossier in her hands, the undeniable proof of a massive embezzlement scheme orchestrated by the very executives she was hired to protect. She had stepped forward then, just as she was tempted to now, fueled by the naive, unwavering belief that the truth was an absolute shield. She had been disastrously wrong. The men she exposed hadn't cowered. They had retaliated with terrifying surgical precision. Within weeks, though her name was blacklisted across the financial sector, her credentials systematically dismantled, and her bank accounts frozen under a cloud of fabricated countercharges. The predators had not only survived, they had stripped her of her identity, her agency, and her voice, leaving her to ghost through life in a crisp white shirt and a black vest, pouring wine for the same breed of monsters she used to hunt. The cramped service station suddenly felt like a cage. Now she gripped the edge of the cool steel counter, fighting the suffocating panic rising in her throat. The trauma of that destruction was a physical weight, anchoring her to the safety of the shadows. Silence had become her only survival strategy, the only way to keep breathing. If she stepped back into that cinematic, moody light and pointed a finger at a mafia boss's trusted advisor, the consequences wouldn't just be a frozen bank account or a smeared reputation. And these were men who settled corporate disputes with silenced weapons and unmarked graves. She opened her eyes, her gaze drawn magnetically back to the center of the room. Hyeonjong Park was still suspended in a moment of lethal hesitation, his dark suit absorbing the light, the pen gleaming darkly in his powerful grip. Behind him, the advisor's anxious silhouette leaned closer, the architect of a brilliant, devastating ruin just seconds away from victory. Elizabeth's breath hitched, or she had promised herself she would never again bleed for a world that punished the truth. But standing in the quiet dark, watching a man unknowingly sign away his life to a parasite in a tailored suit, the silence she had wrapped around herself no longer felt like armor. It felt like complicity. The seconds bled away, each one amplifying the suffocating pressure in the room. From the shadows of the service station, Elizabeth watched the tableau under the golden chandelier with a sickening sense of inevitability. Hyeonjong Park had not moved. The tip of his fountain pen remained suspended a millimeter above the paper, trembling ever so slightly with the force of his rigid grip. His jaw was set, his dark eyes locked onto the dense block of text, searching for the invisible tripwire his instincts swore was there. He was a man who had survived the brutal ascent of the underworld by trusting his gut. And right now, his gut was screaming. Behind him, the advisor's fragile composure finally began to fracture. The tense silence was no longer working in his favor. It was breeding doubt. Stepping just a fraction closer, invading the boss's personal space, the advisor leaned down. He murmured something in low, urgent Korean, a polished smile completely failing to reach his narrowed, anxious eyes. Elizabeth couldn't hear the exact words over the ambient hum of the restaurant, but the cadence was unmistakable. It was the soothing, desperate push of a con artist trying to close a dying mark. The advisor gestured smoothly to the bottom of the page, a physical prompt to just sign and be done with it. Park's chest rose in a deep, weary breath. The heavy brows smoothed out marginally as the advisor's words seemed to pacify his lingering paranoia. He adjusted his grip on the pen, with the silver barrel catching the chandelier's light one last time before he lowered it toward the signature line. In the darkened periphery, the air trapped in Elizabeth's lungs turned to fire. The ticking clock had reached its final second. She saw the trap snapping shut, saw the monumental shift of power about to occur in the stroke of a pen. To stay in the shadows meant survival, but at the cost of her own soul. By doing nothing, while she was letting another architect of ruin walk away with a stolen empire, her hard-won invisibility suddenly felt exactly like the chains her previous enemies had locked her in. If she watched this execution and stayed silent, she wasn't just a victim anymore. She was an accomplice. The pen touched the paper. A tiny dot of black ink bled into the pristine white page. Elizabeth let go of the steel counter. Elizabeth stepped out from the shallow depth of field that separated the bustling, the blurred dining room from the high-contrast isolation of the center table. The crisp rustle of her white button-down shirt was the only sound she registered as she crossed the invisible threshold. Every instinct bred into her during her months of exile screamed at her to turn back, to melt into the moody cinematic shadows hugging the oak-paneled walls. Instead, she moved with a terrifying, absolute purpose. The golden chandelier cast dramatic, heavy light over Hyeonjong Park, now illuminating the exact moment the black ink began to bloom on the pristine white page. Time seemed to fracture, stretching into an agonizing crawl. The advisor's tense silhouette remained hovering just behind Park's left shoulder, his eyes gleaming with the manic relief of a man who thought he had already won. He didn't even notice the waitress approaching from the right until it was too late. In the rigid hierarchy of the syndicate's world, the space immediately surrounding a boss was sacred ground, an invisible fortress guarded by paranoia and lethal consequence. A server was meant to be a ghost, appearing only at the extreme edges of that perimeter to pour water or clear china. To breach that space uninvited was an act of profound disrespect, or worse, a perceived threat. Elizabeth did not just breach it, she shattered it. She didn't reach for a crystal glass or offer a fresh linen napkin. Worse, she stepped directly up to the edge of the heavy mahogany table and planted her feet. The polished veneer of her service persona vanished completely, replaced by the razor-sharp, focused intensity of the fraud investigator she had never truly stopped being. Without a single word of apology or deference, she leaned forward, her body angling confidently into Hyeonjong Park's personal airspace. The sudden, brazen intrusion was so far outside the realm of expected behavior that for a split second, neither the boss nor the traitorous advisor could process what was happening. Park's hand froze, the pen halting its destructive path across the signature line. His heavy, furrowed brows snapped upward, his dark eyes shifting from the contract to the woman now looming in his peripheral vision. The atmosphere in the room instantly turned to ice. Elizabeth's face was mere inches from the mafia boss, her wide, serious eyes completely devoid of the fear that was expected of her. She raised her right hand, her arm steady and resolute beneath the harsh glare of the overhead lights, and brought her index finger down hard against the cream-colored paper. Her finger struck the thick, cream-colored parchment with a sharp, definitive tap that echoed like a gunshot over the quiet clinking of crystal. The tip of her finger rested exactly beneath the dense, predatory paragraph detailing the proxy transfer. Hyeonjong Park's breath caught in his chest. His fountain pen, still hovering a fraction of a millimeter from the paper, ceased its subtle trembling. He did not immediately look at the offending hand. His dark, heavy-lidded eyes snapped directly up to meet Elizabeth's. In the high-contrast, dramatic lighting of the chandelier, her face was a mask of absolute conviction. The shallow depth of field that separated their private, moody bubble from the blurred elegance of the rest of the restaurant seemed to collapse inward, and isolating the three of them in a vacuum of sudden, suffocating tension. She didn't blink. She didn't shrink back from the lethal gravity of the boss sitting before her. Instead, Elizabeth held his gaze, her voice slicing through the heavy air, low, steady, and entirely devoid of a server's mandated deference. "This deal is a trap," she said. The words did not fill the room. They stripped the oxygen from it. A terrifying dead silence plunged over the center table, one so absolute it felt as though the very walls of the wood-paneled suite had stopped breathing. The ambient hum of the distant diners and the soft rush of the ventilation system seemed to vanish entirely. The only thing left in the universe was the devastating weight of her warning hanging over the unsigned document, Park remained entirely motionless, a monolith frozen in the warm, golden light. The mixture of confusion and concern that had plagued his features just moments ago morphed instantly into a terrifying glacial stillness. He was a man who understood the architecture of deception and the sheer audacity of this interruption. A supposedly powerless waitress breaking every rule of survival to point out a flaw in his private contract triggered a primal alarm that his own hesitation hadn't been able to fully articulate. He stared into Elizabeth's wide, serious eyes, searching for the frantic energy of madness or the deceit of a rival setup. He found only the cold, unyielding reflection of the truth. Behind his left shoulder, the cinematic tension finally snapped. The advisor's breath hitched in a sharp, audible gasp. The polished facade of the loyal business partner evaporated, replaced instantly by the raw, naked terror of a cornered animal realizing the snare had just closed on its own leg. The silence stretched, pulled as tight as a wire. Now wrapping around the trio as the ink in Park's pen began to slowly dry. The suffocating stillness that had trapped the table shattered in a violent blur of motion. Behind Hyeonjong Park, the advisor's carefully constructed mask of deference completely disintegrated. The cinematic, high-contrast light from the chandelier caught the sudden, wild terror in his eyes as he realized his meticulously planned corporate execution had just been derailed by a ghost in a waitress uniform. He didn't freeze. Nah, he panicked. With a sharp, breathless curse in Korean, the advisor lunged forward, his dark navy suit tearing through the moody atmosphere of the private suite. He shoved his way into the shallow depth of field that isolated the trio from the rest of the restaurant, his hands reaching desperately. Not to protect the boss, but to silence Elizabeth. "Get away from the table," he snarled, his voice a frantic, ugly hiss that completely destroyed the quiet elegance of the room. He grabbed violently at Elizabeth's forearm, his fingers digging into her white sleeve, trying to physically drag her away from the exposed contract. "She's out of her mind. Security, get this crazy woman out of here right now." The desperate physical contact was a monumental miscalculation. In the apex of the syndicate's hierarchy, a man truly confident in his own loyalty would have stood his ground, offended but composed, allowing the boss to deal with the insubordinate staff. But the advisor's frantic, sweating need to remove Elizabeth before Park could actually read the fine print she was pointing at was the loudest confession he could have possibly made. Elizabeth didn't flinch, nor did she struggle against his bruising grip. She allowed him to act out his guilt in the stark, dramatic lighting of the overhead bulbs, her body remaining as rigid as steel. She kept her gaze locked entirely on Park, holding her ground like an immovable pillar, while letting the advisor's panicked pulling serve as the ultimate proof of her claim. Park had not moved a single muscle to intervene. He remained seated in the heavy leather chair, the fountain pen still suspended in his hand, but the energy radiating from him had turned violently cold. His dark, calculating eyes shifted slowly from Elizabeth's unwavering, serious expression to the trembling man desperately trying to pull her away. The invisible puzzle pieces clicked into place with terrifying clarity. The hesitation Park had felt deep in his gut was justified, and the rat was standing right next to him, broadcasting its own guilt. Hyeonjong Park's voice did not rise to a shout. It didn't need to. A single guttural syllable in Korean, sharp as a physical blade, cut through the frantic scrambling of his advisor. The word was low, vibrating with a lethal suppressed fury that instantly froze the air in the room. The advisor's hands snapped back from Elizabeth's arm as if he had touched a live wire. He stumbled a half-step backward, the high contrast light of the golden chandelier catching the slick sheen of sweat suddenly coating his pale forehead. He opened his mouth to stammer an excuse, to weave one final, desperate lie, but a slow, raised hand from Park silenced him completely. Park finally set the silver fountain pen down. The soft click of the metal against the heavy mahogany table echoed like a judge's final gavel. Elizabeth retreated exactly one step, melting just slightly back toward the cinematic, moody shadows, but she kept her chin high. She watched as the boss leaned forward, pulling the thick cream-colored document directly under the warm, unforgiving glare of the overhead light. His dark eyes locked onto the exact paragraph her finger had struck. For a long, suffocating moment, The only movement in the private suite was the microscopic, rigid tracking of Park's gaze across the dense, predatory legalese. As he read, the shift in the room's atmosphere was terrifying to behold. The initial confusion that had plagued Park's rugged, experienced features evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculating darkness. The muscles in his jaw locked. The slight, almost imperceptible narrowing of his eyes betrayed the violent realization of exactly what he had almost signed. He was not just reading a corporate liability clause. He was staring at the blueprint of his own meticulously planned execution, drafted by the man trembling just inches behind his left shoulder. He saw the irrevocable proxy. He saw the transfer to the secondary holding entity. He saw the devastating architecture of the trap that would have legally stripped his entire empire bare the second his ink dried. Park did not look up immediately. No, he allowed the crushing weight of his silence to press down on the traitor, letting the man drown in the suffocating tension of the room. When the mafia boss finally lifted his head, the stern, impassive mask of the cautious businessman was entirely gone. Staring back at the advisor was the apex predator of the underworld, a man who had just looked ruin in the face and recognized the assassin. Park did not ask a question. He didn't demand an explanation or shout in outrage. None. He simply leaned back into his heavy leather chair, the leather creaking loudly in the dead quiet, and looked at the man in the dark navy suit with eyes as flat and cold as black ice. The verdict had already been rendered. The silence in the room was absolute, heavy, and cold. Hyeonjong Park did not yell, nor did he reach for a weapon. He merely raised 2 fingers, the subtle gesture cutting through the shallow depth of field illuminated by the golden chandelier. The heavy oak doors to the private dining room opened with a soft, muted click. 2 men, who had previously been blending into the blurred, formal background of the luxury restaurant's exterior hallway, slipped inside. They moved with terrifying efficiency, their dark, tailored suits absorbing the moody, cinematic lighting of the space. The advisor's eyes widened in sheer, naked panic, but the high-contrast shadows seemed to swallow his breath before he could scream. One of the security men clamped a massive hand firmly over the traitor's mouth and shoulder, while the other gripped his waist, physically lifting him just enough to break his leverage on the polished floor. It was a choreographed, brutal ballet executed in complete, chilling silence. They dragged him backward, pulling him violently away from the warm glow of the center table and into the cold periphery. The struggle was desperate but entirely muted, a frantic, thrashing resistance that never stood a chance of breaching the thick, soundproofed walls of the VIP suite. Elizabeth stood perfectly still, watching the architect of the trap be swallowed by the darkness. The brutal efficiency of the syndicate was on full display, a stark contrast to the drawn-out legal assassinations she was used to in the corporate world. There were no shouts, no shattered crystal water glasses, no overturned leather chairs to alert the well-dressed diners in the distant, eye-blurred public area. Within seconds, the heavy wooden door clicked shut once more. The advisor was simply gone, erased from the high-stakes equation as if he had never existed. Hyeonjong Park slowly adjusted his suit jacket, his rugged, mature features completely unreadable. The violent removal had left no physical trace on the mahogany table, save for the unsigned contract and the discarded silver fountain pen. The warm, or dramatic lighting continued to beat down on the empty space where the advisor had just been standing, emphasizing the sheer, cold vacuum of his sudden absence. Park reached out and calmly closed the cream-colored folder over the lethal document, his movements deliberate and steady. The immediate threat had been neutralized with ruthless speed. But as the soft, ambient hum of the restaurant's ventilation system filtered back into the room, the heavy, suffocating tension did not dissipate. Instead, it pivoted entirely, locking onto the solitary figure still standing in the light. The execution was over, and now the mafia boss turned his full, undivided attention to the waitress who had just dismantled a corporate assassination. The heavy oak doors clicked shut, sealing the room in a deafening silence. The warm, cinematic light of the golden chandelier now felt less like an opulent glow and more like an interrogation spotlight. Hyeonjong Park did not move to stand, nor did he reach for the discarded contract. He simply sat in the deep leather chair, his dark, calculating eyes locked onto Elizabeth. The rugged lines of his face were devoid of the earlier confusion. They were now etched with a dangerous, piercing curiosity. "An irrevocable proxy," Park finally said, his voice a low, resonant baritone that barely disturbed the quiet air. His English was immaculate, laced with the quiet authority of a man who commanded empires. Buried beneath 3 pages of secondary holding contingencies. My legal team cleared this document. My most trusted partner just tried to bury me with it. He leaned forward slowly, resting his elbows on the polished mahogany. A server in a white button-down does not spot a structural financial trap from 3 feet away while pouring ice water. The command in his gaze was absolute. It wasn't a question. It was a demand for the truth. Elizabeth felt the last remnants of her fragile, mal-constructed safety dissolve under his intense scrutiny. The trauma of her past urged her to lie, to claim she had just made a lucky guess, to apologize and run back to the kitchens. But looking at the apex predator sitting across from her, she knew a lie would be far more lethal than the truth. She took a deep, steadying breath, the crisp rustle of her uniform sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet room. With a deliberate shift in her posture, the deferential, invisible waitress vanished. The Elizabeth straightened her spine, pulling her shoulders back as she stepped fully into the heavy light. The smooth, anxious features of her face hardened into the sharp, analytical mask of the woman she used to be. "My name is Elizabeth Tejada," she said, her voice matching the quiet, steel-edged tone of the room. "Until 8 months ago, I was a senior corporate fraud investigator. I specialized in dismantling shell companies, money laundering fronts, and hostile financial takeovers." Park's eyes narrowed slightly, a silent prompt to continue. "I found a rot inside a massive multinational firm," Elizabeth explained, the bitter weight of the memory anchoring her words. "I pulled the thread, built the case, and brought it to the board. But I underestimated the people I was hunting. They didn't just fire me. They fabricated evidence, froze my assets, and erased my career overnight. I took this job because wearing this vest was the only way I could disappear before they decided to permanently silence me." She met his stern, impassive gaze without a single flicker of hesitation. "I know how a trap is built, Mr. Park, because I know exactly how predators think." Hyeonjong Park absorbed her words in absolute silence. The cinematic high-contrast light from the chandelier seemed to carve the rugged lines of his face even deeper as he evaluated the woman standing before him. And for months she had been a ghost serving expensive plates to dangerous men. Yet in a matter of seconds, she had proven more valuable than his entire legal division. She hadn't just saved his empire. She had demonstrated a rare, ruthless intellect. "You hid in the shadows because you believed the corporate world was uniquely corrupt," Park finally said, his deep voice breaking the heavy stillness of the wood-paneled room. "For you thought wearing that uniform would protect you from predators." He leaned back against the dark leather of his chair, his dark eyes never leaving hers. "But as you saw tonight, Miss Tejada, predators do not care what room you are in. They only care if you are blind to their teeth." Elizabeth stood her ground. The panicked tremor that had threatened to consume her in the service station was completely gone, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. She had spent almost a year running from the fire, and only to find herself standing perfectly steady in the center of an inferno. Park gestured a strong, steady hand toward the empty chair to his left, the very space his traitorous advisor had occupied just minutes prior. "My world is not built on boardrooms or fabricated evidence," he stated smoothly. "It is built on loyalty, consequence, and survival. My enemies smile at me, pour my drinks, and write lethal clauses into my future. I do not need another lawyer who signs where they are told. And I need an investigator who can dissect the lies before the ink even touches the paper." He let the offer hang in the moody, heavy air of the suite. It was a dangerous invitation. Stepping into the syndicate meant abandoning the fragile grayscale safety she had meticulously built. It meant facing down men far more ruthless than the executives who had ruined her. But looking at the empty space under the warm, golden light, Elizabeth realized that safety had always been an illusion. More true protection didn't come from being invisible. It came from being dangerous. She looked down at her hands. They were no longer the trembling hands of a powerless worker. They were the hands of an architect who knew how to tear down the walls her enemies hid behind. With a slow, deliberate motion, Elizabeth reached behind her waist. The soft, clean snap of the fabric echoed in the quiet room as she untied her black service apron. She let it slide from her waist, mourned the physical weight of her disguise falling away, and draped it carelessly over the back of a leather chair. She stepped forward, pulling out the chair beside the mafia boss, and took her seat at the table.